Good morning. And sticking with the themes of the holidays, we'll continue to discuss things that are associated with the symbolism of the holidays. And in doing so, in sticking with those themes, we can see that there is a timetable that God is operating on. Hey, Mark, if possible, I don't want to run too long, because I guess what I'm going to say I could knock out in not too long, but are you able to put time? Yeah, so I could kind of keep track. And if I start to run long, anyone is able to throw stuff at me. It's permitted. In keeping with the themes of the season, it's important to recognize that there are certain time measurements that God will use that in the Church of God culture we become accustomed to referring to or recognizing. One of which would be that 7,000-year period that God has outlined, and how he will deal with humanity and bringing humanity back into a relationship with him. Most are familiar with that, and so I won't break that down too much right now. Another pattern of time in which God would use to designate the amount of time or the timeline by which he would go by would be the creation week. And we see with each day, if you look at the story of Genesis, that the symbolism, that the narrative that we read is, in addition, has symbolic qualities, so that the steps that we see taking place each day are also a narrative of how God would deal with mankind. The 24-hour day is another period of time. The day begins at night. You would think, well, why doesn't it start in the morning? That makes more sense. But according to the events that man is engaged in and how he has separated from God, the day begins with a night period, a dark period, a separation period. And then the light comes afterwards. And likewise, we see the same thing with the Sabbath ending on the seventh day. A time period where God is present. After 6,000 years, that last 1,000 years, he is present, where God rested during that period of time. And of course, we have the holy days, mapping out God's strategic plan in dealing with mankind. Another example of that would be the Psalms. People don't often look at the Psalms that way. The Psalms are divided into 5 books. And each book, when you look at how the Psalms are broken down, it's centered around, you can say, one of the holy day periods. And all the scriptures encapsulated in that period contain prophecies and other scriptures related to the events that would take place during each of those holy day periods, or the steps in which man is being dealt with by God. Another time period would be, or a timeline that God uses, would be that of agriculture. And that's the one I'm going to talk about today. We are detached from agriculture, and we don't measure the world by that. We measure the world by when the baseball season starts, when football season starts, tax season. We use the retail timeline of Christmas and the holiday season and things like that. But agriculture, no. Maybe your nephew's birthday and so forth. That's how we designate time, when you're going to get time off from work, so on and so forth. But agriculture, we're detached from that world. But in the world of the Bible, the agriculture was dominant in terms of how life worked. Because if you wanted to eat, when it's dinner ready, so to speak, dinner's ready when it grows. That's when dinner ready. That's when you eat, when it grows. And so we've kind of stepped away from that And the holy days and a lot of the events and ceremonies that surround this period are tied into agriculture. So we will take a look at some agriculture and how that relates to some of the days. And we'll start with Exodus 34. Exodus 34 and verse 21. 6 days you shall labor, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Even during the plowing season and harvest, you must rest. So we get the sense that there's a weekly period and then there's a Sabbath. That's the first order of business, the first building block that we're going to use to talk about whatever it is I'm going to talk about today. And we have already established there exists a Sabbath where things stop. You take a break, you cease from work. Chapter 34, dropping down to verse 26. And here we find an instruction to bring the best of the first fruits of your soil to the house of the Lord your God. This really isn't referring to the first fruits, but rather the first fruits of the first fruits. Before Israel was able to start digging into the food, beginning to reap the barley, which is the first staple that was prepared and ready. It was the first thing that was grown, much akin to when you are waiting to eat and you're having a family gathering. You want to stick a spoon in the pot and kind of take a taste, or take your finger and scoop some of the icing off the cake. It's not ready yet. Somebody should be standing by to smack your hand when you try to do that. And so this is the way Israel's agriculture worked. There was an offering or a ceremonial offering that was to be conducted before you could begin to eat the staples that were ready, the food, the grains that were ready. The first grain that would be ready would be barley. The wheat will not be ready for some time, according to the agricultural timeline. That wheat is synonymous with what we recognize during Pentecost. Here we find ourselves around the Passover season, where this barley is now coming to be ready to be reaped. But before you could touch the barley, before you could touch the wheat thereafter, there was a portion of grain that would be taken and offered in the ceremony. And they would be the first of the first fruits. The first fruits are considered the wheat that is gathered during the period between Pentecost and the 4 holy days. But the first fruits of the first fruits is that small staple of barley that is taken. That small staple of barley is often called the wave sheaf. Yes, sir. Or it's called the omer. And we'll look at that a little bit more as we go along. Leviticus 23, here again, we see the instructions that God gives relating to some of the holidays that are to be recognized. 23, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, these are my appointed festivals, the appointed festivals of the Lord, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies." Verse 3, there are 6 days when you may work, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath rest, a day of sacred assembly. And here we are today. So we got that. As I said before, there's the Sabbath. So everybody's on the same page. Continuing on, verse 4, these are the Lord's appointed festivals, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at their appointed times. The Lord's Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month. So that's the next thing that we have. We have the Sabbath, and now we have Passover. Continuing on, verse 6, on the 15th day of that month, the Lord's festival of unleavened bread begins. For 7 days you must eat bread made without yeast. On the first day hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. For 7 days present a food offering to the Lord. And on the seventh day hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. Again, we have the Sabbath, we have Passover. Then we have the first day of unleavened bread, where God says, don't do any work. And then you have this seventh day of unleavened bread, where God also says, don't do any work. We see that there are sacred assemblies associated with some of these days. But one of the most important features is you're not going to do any work on the Sabbath, you're not going to do any work on the first day of unleavened bread, and you're not going to do any work on the seventh day of unleavened bread. Continuing on in verse 9. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I am going to give you, and you reap its harvest, bring to the priest a sheaf of the first grain you harvest. When the Israelites were to enter the promised land, starting once they entered, they would begin to keep all of the instructions that God had laid out in terms of ceremonies and such. And one of them was once they began planting food, because they're going to be stagnant now in the land of Israel. They're not going to be moving around. They're going to plant food, and they're going to lay roots, hence the term. They're going to lay roots, plant food. Before they can begin to eat anything, they're going to take a portion of those grains and offer it. And the first portion that will be ready are the grains from barley. It's not the first fruits, that's the wheat in Pentecost. These are the first of the first fruits. Grains offered before you get to all the wheat. Continuing on, referring to the priest. He is to wave the sheaf before the Lord so it will be accepted on your behalf. So it's not actually waved. We see wave as, yo, what's up, what's good? It's not that. There's a YouTube thing where you could look, there's a bear. These people are going through a trail looking at the animals, and the bear is expecting food. And he sits up and he waves. It's so freaky. Absolutely nothing to do with what I'm talking about today. However, the wave sheaf is not waved. It is raised. When you look at the Hebrew, it is raised up and then brought back down. It is called the wave sheaf, but there's no waving. Secondly, it's not a sheaf. There's not stalks of grain. The stalks are taken and it's broken down so that it's grain. You know what rice grains are. So these are barley grains. And it appears that some are not accustomed with barley or eating it in this manner, but it's included in a lot of soups and such, so you may not recognize the texture. It's like a cross between oatmeal and rice in terms of the texture when you eat it. That's what was offered, those grains, about 3 quarts of it. And those grains were raised up and then brought back down.
Yes, sir.
Next step, when was this supposed to be done? He is to wave the sheaf before the Lord so it will be accepted on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath. So, we have a Sabbath, and we understand what that is. Then we have Passover. Then we have the first day of unleavened bread, where you don't do any work. And then you have the 7th day of unleavened bread, where you don't do any work.
Yes, sir.
This wave sheaf was to be done after the Sabbath. There has been confusion in the religious world as regarding when this is supposed to be done. The way God outlined it and explained it, he said to do it after the Sabbath. If you look at Leviticus 23, thus far, the only thing he called the Sabbath was Saturday. When he referred to the first day of unleavened bread, he just said, it's a day where you're not going to work. When he referred to the 7th day of unleavened bread, he just said, it's a day you're not going to work. He didn't use the word Sabbath, so there's no confusion. As you continue through the other holy days, he begins to use the word Sabbath towards those holy days, but he distinctly doesn't use it yet so that there's no confusion. The timeline says that this wave sheaf is to be offered the day after the Sabbath. The only time he used, if you're using the definitions of what a Sabbath is referring to Saturday. So Saturday, during the period of after Passover, the period of unleavened bread, but after Passover, the first Saturday is when this wave sheaf is to be offered. And the way that's done, after that wave sheaf is offered, 50 days are counted. From that point,
Yes, sir.
after you finish a count of 50 days, you arrive at Pentecost.
Yes, sir.
If you begin counting on the first Sabbath after Passover, 50 days later, you have Pentecost. If you do it any other variation, you're going to land on a different day. The Pharisees used a different count. They didn't start counting on the first Sabbath. they started counting on the day of unleavened bread, the first holy day. Yes. In their minds, they're going, it's the Sabbath. God didn't use that word, so that confusion shouldn't start. But it did. And so their recognition of Pentecost always lands on the same calendar date, the 6th of Shivav. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that word right. At any rate, it always lands on the same date. Hence, you'll notice the Jews today, Pentecost never lands on the same day as us. On occasion it will, but for the most part it doesn't, and that's why. They're counting differently. The Sadducees counted a little bit differently as well. They started counting on the first Saturday after Passover. However, if Passover was a Saturday, then they didn't count to the following Sabbath, this following week, and their count would be off on those years where Passover is a Saturday. Why is this important? Why is this significant? It's significant because that wave sheaf, that omer, because there's not just a sheaf of grain, it's little grains, that omer, that's what it's called, the grain that was raised and brought back down, is representative of Christ after his resurrection, presenting himself to the Father. The importance of having that done at the right time symbolically has some implications. Many times when your count is off, the wave sheaf is being, or the omer is being offered outside of the Passover holidays, outside of the days of unleavened bread. And again, if you look at it that way, and Christ is that representation, and Christ has taken on the sin of all mankind, it's going to happen in that period that's designated where mankind's sins are being removed and not attributed to him because of Christ's sacrifice. If that's done outside of that time period, it could be confusing and doesn't make sense. So it's important that Christ's sacrifice comes in that period so that all those that will follow can have their sins removed symbolically in terms of the figuration here and not imputed to them. Right on. So that's what the omer is. Now, for further clarification on when the right time to do that is, we can look at how things played out in the narratives of the Gospels. And from what I understand, this year, much like the 31st, much like 31 AD, the days are correlated, where the week falls on the same day that Christ was sacrificed, and the holy days fall on the same days. So it's easier to look at if we do turn and look at that real quickly now. So I'll do that real quick and try to do that fast. Again, if any of you get impatient and it's like, you know what, let's move on, just throw something. And then I'll take that to mean, okay, it's time to stop, because I got the gist of what I wanted to get across anyway. So let's look and start with John chapter 19. John 19. John 19 and verse 38. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. First point, Roman law dictated that only a family member could claim the body of one crucified, which is where this thing comes from. Well, oh, Joseph may have been Christ's uncle. Does it say that? No. But that's how people begin to say things like that. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now, Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, because he feared the Jewish leaders. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. And so we see they took Christ's body really quickly. They put things together, and they used some incense and scents and oils to create a body wrapping so they could put him in the tomb. And there was a rush. There was a rush because he was killed on Passover afternoon. 3 o'clock, he passed away. He had to quickly be taken down because once the sun set, the first day of unleavened bread would begin, as it did for us. So when we look at the narrative in the Gospels, a lamb is taken on the 10th and set aside without blemish. Jesus Christ entered Jerusalem on the 10th. knowing they were looking for him, they're trying to get at him. He came through anyway. On the 10th, he comes into Jerusalem. He is killed on the 14th and dies. Now his body is quickly taken and put into the tomb that Joseph had. We find that Joseph was a wealthy man, and if you turn and look at Isaiah 53, verse 9, you'll see a reference to the fact that Christ was, put to death along with sinners and criminals, but at the same time he was buried with the rich. He was put in Joseph's tomb. I don't have time to flip over there. Mark chapter 15, we see the same thing, and it's the same account from one of the other Gospels, but it may or add a little bit of more detail, but it's saying the same thing in Mark 15 and verse 42. It was preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath, meaning the high Sabbath or the first high Sabbath, the day of unleavened bread, and that's why they were rushing. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, so he was a part of the religious body. There's argument as to whether he was a Pharisee or a Sadducee, but he was down with that political crew, which is why he kept his true beliefs secret. Pilate, verse 44, again, he went to Pilate to get Christ's body and prepare the body and quickly put him in the tomb. Luke 23, again, you'll see the same narrative. Luke 23 in verse 50. Now there was a man named Joseph, a member of the council, a good and upright man, who had not consented to their decision in action to kill Christ. He was a believer. And as we see, Christ's body was quickly washed, addressed, and put in the tomb, and it was preparation day for the first day of unleavened bread. The Jews would get ready way before the actual Sabbath or the holy day started. And you see how that confusion can start, because the holy day indeed is a Sabbath, but in Leviticus 23, God didn't call the first day of unleavened bread or the seventh day of unleavened bread a Sabbath, so as not to spark up any confusion. So here we have Christ dies on Wednesday afternoon. Wednesday night, he's put in the tomb. So Wednesday night to Thursday night, that's one day and one night.
Yes, sir.
That was the preparation day. Wednesday in the daylight portion of the first day of unleavened bread. So, I didn't keep reading when I was reading those examples. If I had kept reading, we will have seen that also with Joseph, the ladies were there present. Well, I'll find one and read the end. Where did I stop? Luke 23, 50 something. Verse 55, the women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. So we see Mary Magdalene, Mary, I think the wife of Salome. I may be getting the Marys mixed up. There was another Mary in there as well. This is often referred to as the other Mary. So there were three women nonetheless that accompanied Joseph as well, that kind of stayed back. But they watched Joseph and Nicodemus put Christ's body in the tomb. They themselves also wanted to clean Christ's body, a real good cleaning, proper way, respectful way. And they couldn't, because things had to be done real quick because the holy day was starting. So they couldn't do that. So Wednesday night to Thursday night, first day of unleavened bread, they put him in the tomb quickly. Thursday night to Friday night, that was free time. But during that free time, the ladies went and they got the oils and the things that they would use so that they could clean his body. That took time to do. And the story ain't going to open until the Sabbath had ended with the first day of unleavened bread. And so Thursday morning, they go out and they go to the stores and get what they had to get. So from that daylight portion, that's when they went and purchased all that they needed. They didn't get a chance to make it and then go clean Christ's body yet, because now the Sabbath was going to start, the weekly Sabbath. Yes, so you have Wednesday night to Thursday night, and then that kicks off the first day of unleavened bread. Thursday night to Friday night in the daylight portion, free time, but they couldn't go clean the body because the Sabbath was now starting. And that Friday in the daylight is the preparation day for the Sabbath. So now we have Wednesday night to Thursday night. And then you have Thursday night to Friday night free time. And in the daytime is also, so as not to confuse people. During the week, we're going from night to night. That's how the Jews see a day. So if I go Thursday night to Friday night, to the Jews, we're kind of in between 2 days, so to speak. So you got to translate in your own head. Thursday night to Friday night is a period of time, but for the Jews, it's one day, Thursday night to Friday night. But we see it as, all right, that's Thursday night, and then Friday is the next day. But just try to recognize that differentiation there. So we have Wednesday night to Thursday night, and then we have Thursday night to Friday night, makes 2 days. Friday night starts the Sabbath. The ladies were unable to go clean the body. Friday night to Saturday night is that period of time is the weekly Sabbath. Soon as the Sabbath is over, Saturday night, now they're like, all right, let's go take care of this and go clean the body. They didn't get a chance to before. And in that period of time, 3 days has gone by. And we see how Christ's body was placed in the tomb. When we look at Mark 16, we look at Mark 16, verse 1.
Yes.
You'll see that there's a line of scripture, contains information, and then you stop. And then you may have insets that take place. The story isn't continuing, as it'll throw you off in your synchrony. Verse 16, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Stop. Separate thought. They went and did that during that daylight period of Friday. Also, the way that this is translated is confusing because it'll throw you off with the synchrony. I'll use Matthew 28 to explain what I'm talking about. Matthew 28, verse 1. After the Sabbath, at dawn, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. And you look at this and it's like, okay, that doesn't make sense. What's going on when you try to combine all the other Gospels? So, after the Sabbath, indeed it was after the Sabbath. At dawn, it wasn't early in the morning. At this point in time, it was later in the afternoon. Because what happens first is the ladies, and they go and they look at the burial site. But they don't go to do anything else, and they do that late Saturday night. Late Saturday night, when you combine all the Gospels, you'll see they go and they look, and that's it. And they see the guards there, and they see the tomb is being guarded. And that's more than likely all that was done. They just looked. And that's why it says they went and they looked at the tomb. Another translation from the Darby translation has it written differently because it isn't, the Darby translation designates not dawn but dusk in the evening of Saturday night as opposed to after the Sabbath in the morning. So I'll read from the Darby translation. Now late on Sabbath, as it was the dusk of the next day after Sabbath, came Mary of Magdala and the other Mary to look at the sculpture or sepulchre. So this is the timeline. When Christ is resurrected and he comes out the tomb, at that moment, the wave sheaf is being cut by the priest so that he get prepared and ground up to become the omer, to be raised up and then brought back down in the ceremony. And when you turn to John chapter 20, you see that if you go according to how you combine all the Gospels, the ladies go, they look at the gravesite. But then, that's on a Saturday night, just checking everything out. Mary Magdalene comes back Sunday morning while it's still dark, John chapter 20 and verse 1. And she comes back, and now the stone is rolled back. And it's like, what's going on? The stone is rolled back, and she finds that that Christ is there. She's speaking to him. She thinks it's the gardener, and she goes to embrace him. And he tells her, don't touch me, because I have not risen to the Father as yet. He had not yet been raised up as pictured by the Omer. In that period of time, She runs back to tell Peter and John that, look, the stone was rolled back. I saw Christ. I saw Jesus. Now remember, Mary Magdalene is the crazy one, and no one taking her seriously. She had 7 demons cast out of her. The sense you get is, she had some issues. But she's a believer. She's recovered. Yep. But again, she's a little out there. If you had 7 demons cast out of you, who's to say what kind of condition you were in to have that happen, and 2, what kind of condition you were in afterwards. So yeah, nobody's taking her seriously. So if you read Mark 16, 9 through 11, and again, some question whether that is legitimate because it's not in the original, some earlier text, you'll read, she tells the apostles and the disciples, I saw Christ, and nobody believed her. Nobody was taking her seriously. When you read again, you see the ladies are coming back to clean the body. More than likely, the other Marys are with her, and they weren't believing her either. And then they see, it's true, the stone was rolled back, and they encounter Christ, but now they embrace him, and he doesn't say, don't touch me. He had already been raised as the Omer and brought back down. Another thing, Leviticus, and I'll end with this, Leviticus 23. Leviticus 23. I just wanted to point out what the Omer was. Oftentimes, we'll have some sort of decoration reflecting what the Omer is. And it would be literally just grains of barley on a plate or in a cup. And we may have had that today. Perhaps it'll be set out on our next meeting. But many years when that is done, the opportunity to explain it isn't there, and people, either 1, don't know what it is, or 2, they question, what do you have up there? What is all that about? And why is this even important? That's why it's important. It's relevant in terms of how we count Pentecost, but in the meaning of what is being accomplished in Christ, presenting himself to the Father as that Omer is raised up and then brought back down. Yes, sir. I have another point to make, actually a rhetorical question. I'm not going to make a point. I'm going to ask a question, and I'm not going to answer it, which is not the way you break down a sentence. Usually there's an answer accompanying it, but I got to stop. So Leviticus 23, verse 15. We read about the Omer. Now we're going to read about Pentecost in those 50 days. From the day after the Sabbath, the day you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, count off 7 full weeks, which is what we do. And matter of fact, in one of the scriptures that I glanced over real quick, when it said, it was Matthew, I think it was 28, which says on the first day after the Sabbath. That's not the correct translation. It's the first day, the first Sabbath of weeks is the way that would be translated in Matthew, showing that Pentecost is coming after this count. So, from the day after the Sabbath, the day you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, count off 7 full weeks. Count off 50 days up to after the 7th Sabbath, and then present an offering of new grain to the Lord. From wherever you live, bring 2 loaves made of 2/10 of an ephah of the finest flour, baked with yeast with leaven, as a wave offering of first fruits. So, the first wave offering, the first fruits of the first fruits was barley. It represents Christ being raised. Now we get to Pentecost, similar ceremony, but this time 2 loaves are wave sheaf, and it's the first fruits of all the grains pulled during Pentecost. And this also is raised up just like the Omer was, and then brought back down. Present this bread with 7 male lambs, each of a year old and without defect, and it has some other accompaniments that also accompany the Omer, but we see that there's blood also involved. In verse 20, the priest is to wave the 2 lambs before the Lord as a wave offering, together with the bread of the first fruits. So, we see the Omer being raised as Christ, representing Christ presenting himself to the Father and then brought back down. And then 50 days later, we see the first fruits all gathered together, the 2 loaves, often looked at as representing the church, and that too is waved, raised up, and brought back down. What's that about? We looked at the Omer and saw Christ presented himself to the Father and then came back down. Yes, sir. And now we see these 2 loaves, and according to Church of God culture, these two loaves represent the church and all the saints because they have leaven, but the blood has been applied to them. They too are raised and then brought back down. What could that mean? It's very interesting. However, I have to stop. And so that would be what the Omer represents, and it is enlightening and enthusiastic to see what these things are.